So I'm really excited, Luke, that you're back on History and Games
I am excited to be
because
back.
last time we talked about all the awesome video games that feature ancient Greek names. There are quite a few games like Hades and Immortals and Assassin's Creed Odyssey, but
Mm.
now we're into your forte, which happens to be ancient Latin in all its different forms. And I picked two games to choose Latin names from because one has to do with actual historical people. So that's
Hmm.
Assassin's Creed Origins, although I have to say that the Latin in that is apparently a hot mess. We'll talk about that because you did a hilarious video on that game and how the Latin just descends into utter chaos and becomes a total word salad. And then I wanted to go over Final Fantasy because I have a lot of people who watch this channel and they all love Final Fantasy like I do. And I feel like those names are more like church Latin. So we can sort of cover both. And I think it's a good opportunity for you to talk about the difference between, say, church Latin and earlier forms of Latin, because they're not necessarily the same thing.
Okay, that sounds like fun.
Yeah.
Take
So
it
before,
away.
all right. So before we dive into some of the gobbledygook Latin in Assassin's Creed, can you briefly explain to the audience the difference between, say, the Latin Julius Caesar would have used and then Church Latin centuries later?
Well, we actually fundamentally nothing. There are some subtle things, but very, very little, and that's because Latin has been deliberately made to be conservative in a way that's especially unique, even compared with Greek and ancient Greek, which was highly conservative. And it's still with you have the various stages of Greek, from the Homeric poetical stuff. You have the classical Attic. You have the 800 years of Koine, Kini for our modern Greek people. That is this, it's highly conservative, but it does show some not insignificant changes developmentally. Whereas Latin does have a few changes that occur, but mostly those are undone as time goes on. That is, it goes more and more back, even in any time when we think of Latin as being used a lot by the church, for example, which makes sense. Educated people, especially in the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, we think of the educated people being clergy in particular, as well as a few other elite people who would know Latin really well. And in that period, we see already a significant amount of conservation and return to classical Latin norms. And Julius Caesar and Marcus Tullius Cicero represent the gold standard of what Latin is as we think of it. Everything they wrote is like the ideal, because everybody's imitated them essentially. The late Latin literature period goes from the 3rd century to the 9th century. And that basically until we get to the medieval period after Charlemagne. And that's where we see in the 4th, 5th century Jerome's Vulgate Bible in particular. That's probably what some people might think of as where there's some more significant grammatical changes. For example, and I think I had in one of my videos where I talked about how in standard Latin, we say, I think it to be true. We cannot say in standard Latin, I think that it is true. That's construction impossible. But then by the late Latin period, that form of construction, I think it to be true, that becomes impossible. So in the Bible, and the Latin Vulgate Bible is translated by Jerome, I think that it is true is the only way to express that idea. And then later by the first Latin Renaissance period, which was under Charlemagne, 9th century, and then later in the what we think of as the normal Western European Renaissance, 14th, 15th century, we get constantly this classicization of the language back to Caesar. The biggest difference between something more recent Latin-wise and something of the late Roman Republic is just new vocabulary, really, not anything grammatically. So anybody who uses Latin, who learns Latin, who speaks Latin today, is aiming to express him or herself fundamentally in the same manner as Caesar.
Okay, that's a great explanation. That sort of took us through the different centuries and how it's not wildly different, and it sort of came full circle. through time. So that's actually
Yeah.
really interesting. And I wish they had consulted you for Assassin's Creed, because you did a hilarious video about Assassin's Creed Origins, where it's all about the Latin in that game. And apparently it's all gobbledygook. At one point it just descends into utter chaos.
Yes.
And it's pretty funny. I'll put a link in this video to that video, because I was rewatching it this morning. I was just cry laughing.
That was me live responding to it. I didn't prepare that for it. That was me like, is this trolling me? Yeah, it's because it was.
Yeah, I think excuse me was like the one sentence they got completely right, and then they would start with a sentence that started to make sense, and then it just completely dissipates
Yeah.
into utter nonsense. But at least they had real characters from history in the game, and I was going to ask you how to pronounce them if we were talking to Julius Caesar. He may not respond to Caesar, although you had a great rant video about like being snotty about how to pronounce some of these names.
Yeah.
People get a little uptight about it. But for example, we talked last time in my last video about the name Cleopatra, right? So her father's glory, basically. And her brother, this has an unusual spelling, by the way. Is it Ptolemy? Her
Ptolemy
brother,
is usually
Ptolemy.
how we say his name in English.
Okay, and it's spelled with it starts with a P. And I'm
Good
not
old silent initial P in English.
Yeah, it's just like,
Like
why is it there?
psychology.
Yeah.
Psicologia.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just it doesn't really work if you're trying to look these things up in a dictionary. But then you have, all right, the name of ancient Rome, Julius Caesar. And if I were going to warn him about the Ides of March, how would I try to hail him? Hail Caesar, hail, what am I saying?
So his name, as it is in the when it's the subject of the sentence, Julius Caesar, Julius Caesar. But if we're going to address him, like and if you want to think of it this way, whenever we say, "Hi Meg, hi Luke," that's what we're doing. We're addressing someone. Now, Latin has occasionally special forms for specifically Latin for names of Latin origin. They're not necessarily Greek ones or other foreign ones. So Latin names that end with an us that are masculine. So Julius, actually Marcus. Let's talk about Marcus, and we'll talk about that in a second. So Marcus, you want to say hello, Mark, you'd say ave or salve Marque. So the us becomes e. So salve Marque. It's called the vocative case because you are vocare, you're calling the person, vocare, vocative. So salve Marque. But ius becomes just e. Salve Juli. I call myself Lucius in Latin, so you would say salve Luci. So Juli Caesar, ave, cave idus Martias. Beware the Ides of March.
All right. Somebody, I think, told him that, and he kind of ignored it. And then
He did.
You shouldn't have done that. What's interesting
Yeah.
is this true that I know there are various reports that when Caesar died, he didn't actually say the famous Shakespeare line. He may have said something in Greek, something along and I don't know how to pronounce it correctly, which is why you're here, but it's something like "Kesu teknon," you too, child.
Indeed. Very good. Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting because there's a debate as to whether he was like, oh, you too, or you too. I hope you get stabbed too. And ironically, his enemy would actually commit suicide. So we'll get to him in a minute. But it was an interesting thing that I looked up, and I learned long ago, like and you too, Brutus, the whole William Shakespeare thing is not true, but that he did possibly say something, but it was in Greek, not Latin. So I thought that was, I was going to confirm with you if you think that is a true story or not.
Yeah, some historians don't say he said anything, and other historians said that his final word was "Caesiutek non et tu brute." I don't think any Roman, that is to say Latin writing historian, wrote that per se. "Et tu brute" is essentially I think is a Shakespearean translation. I don't remember, but it's interesting because the ancient historians are good, but when it comes to the kind of factual reporting, it's a little bit different. than we think of today. And good examples would be like Thucydides, the ancient Greek historian, who would give all these amazing speeches to these people that were like really like amazing, you know, these speeches before wars and stuff. Livy, the Roman historian, did things like that too. And it's not really credible that that's what, like, they're it's almost artistic license for those kinds of things. So whether or not he said something, you know, I mean, these historians aren't there for the most part. They're getting, there's sometimes there's centuries later that they're writing this stuff down.
Right.
So, you know, how much can we believe that there was this cordial talk between Scipio Africanus and Hannibal at the Battle of Zama? It's a lovely, really great part. It's one of my favorite parts of that history. But you know, did they really say those things?
I was rereading Herodotus the other day, and he had a Spartan give like a 4-page speech, and I'm like, they're laconic. The guy probably said 4 words in a sentence, and that was it. But it makes for an interesting story. And what is story? His story. We're going to continue with another Latin name. It eventually became Mark Antony. He is the lover of Cleopatra. But if I wanted to talk to him and tell him to quit crying on a beach, whatever that famous story is, what would I call him?
Well, Marcus Antonius is the subject form, the nominative form of his name.
Right.
If you're talking to him, the vocative is Marc Antoni. Salve Marc Antoni. Marche Antoni.
Okay, so that's actually right to say Mark Antony in American English. It's at least sort of close to how you would hail it.
I mean, what in English we sometimes truncate Latin or Greek or French, whatever it is, words in that way. Mostly actually in the style of French, if not directly because of French. Sometimes we don't, like Julius and not Julie or Jules or something. I mean, Cicero was known as Tully up until like the 19th century. Then people started calling him Cicero more. But Tully, Tullius, was like how everybody knew him in English for centuries.
Right. Caligula's name wasn't actually Caligula, right?
I think what were all his names? I think it was like Gaius, Julius, Caesar, Nero, or something. Like they all had Claudius. They all like had these same 3 or 4 names that they were exchanging. Metatron has a great video actually where he gives like their name. Caligula was this nickname he had as a youth, which he hated.
Oh, I see. Like, I didn't know he hated it.
Yeah, apparently he wasn't fond of that.
Okay. This next name is interesting. Lucius Septimius.
Yeah, English would say Lucius Septimius or Lucius or Lucius, whatever you want to do. Septimius. And in classical Latin pronunciation, Lucius Septimius.
That's cool. I like that pronunciation.
And of course, ecclesiastical would be Lucius instead of Lucius.
And this next one actually kind of ties into an ancient Greek pronunciation that I was curious about. We didn't get to last time, but Greek names that start with EU, because over time it sort of became like a V sound, like Evmenides instead of
Excellent.
Eumenes.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if I say Udoros, it's a character in Assassin's Creed, but I have no idea if I'm saying that right.
Udoros would be English.
Right.
EU, those EU, excuse me, EU, these are the letters names. So the EU, U, like euphony, or euphemism and so forth. U is just how we say it in English, and that's how we say it in English. So Udoros, and or maybe Udoras, because the spelling here is actually the we're using Roman letters, Eudoros. Often Greek names in English are Latinized, and not just in spelling, but also in other conventions, like the final OS, which is the nominative or subject form of the name, the most, usually we could say the most basic form of the name. What's a good example? Dionysus ends in an us, right? US.
Right.
But it's an OS in Greek. Because this all comes from Proto-Indo-European. In Proto-Indo-European, it's os, and that's the usually masculine, but not necessarily exclusively. Very often a masculine ending when it's the nominative case, os. Latin changes that final os to us, but it's essentially the same ending, and it has these grammatical changes that it goes through. Greek and Latin have very similar grammatical changes for the nouns. It's called a case system: nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, and so forth. And for that reason, Latin very easily, very easily adapts Greek words into it and just uses the Latin versions of the endings, which are rather similar to the Greek ones. So a name like Dionysos, Dionysus, Dionysus in Latin just changes the os to us. But here we have Eudoros instead of Eudorus. You could do that in Latin. It would be take a German name like Helena and make it Helene in English. Yeah, that's how it's spelled. Kind of, I don't know. That'd be sort of change. So anyway, the change that of the eu eventually becomes ev by the modern Greek time. So Evdoros in modern Greek, but in Latin, Eudoros, Eudorus.
And then we're going to do one final name before we move on to Final Fantasy, which is what I really want to get to because some of these names are hilarious. But the last name for Assassin's Creed is Gaius Cassius
Is it
Longinus.
It's Longinus, right? Longinus.
It might be. It might be a typo.
Yeah,
that I have.
I think it's because Longinus or Longinus is that is a name.
Yeah,
I'm
I think that's
with.
a typo in my part. Yeah, which is a dangerous thing to do because spell check doesn't know what to do with that.
Oh, tell me about it. Yeah, I always have to turn it off. Gaius Cassius. Gaius. Gaius is actually 3 syllables. We say Gaius, of course, in English, 2 syllables, bum bum, Gaius. But in Latin, it's Gaius, bum bum bum, Gaius.
Gaius.
Gaius. It's hard to pronounce. It's 3 syllables, but that's how it's supposed to be. Cassius, and then Longinus, classical period. Longinus, ecclesiastical.
All right, there we go.